our default assumption when we see a man participating in women's sports is that that person is a malignant narcissist. Because, first of all, obviously, because all you have to do is think about it for 15 seconds. And I'm dead serious about this. It's like, okay, you're Leah Thomas. I think that was William, if I remember correctly.
Yes, that's right.
And that's a non-crime hate incident for those of you in the UK who want to report it. And so he's 6'4", I think. That's about right. Massive shoulders, you know, a fairly powerful swimmer. I think he ranked 400th in the US among American swimmers of his age, which is not bad, right? I mean, it's not number one, and he definitely wanted to be number one. But then you think, just put yourself in this position for a minute. You're like 1.5 feet taller than the people that you're competing against and 6 inches broader in the shoulder. And when you get up on the podium and there's a claim, not only do you enjoy it, which is a sign that there's something seriously wrong with you to begin with, but you also are so deluded that you think you deserve it and that you're a brave once victim for managing it. Now, just contemplate that. Imagine writing a script about that. Do you know how staggeringly narcissistic you have to be to accept even one of those propositions, let alone to play yourself off as a heroic victim while you're doing it?
Well,
you
not to be embarrassed.
Women off their podium, and it's like you're the forthright champion of what? Civil rights or something. What do you think? It's so sickening.
Laurel Hubbard, the weightlifter in New Zealand, was the son of a billionaire. He's like the son of, like, the equivalent would be Kellogg's, you know, something like that in New Zealand. And he beat 2 Indigenous women who had worked their whole lives, you know, to get to where they are. And now they've got second and third. And this man, this clear man, is got first. And
he's an average man, but he's a hell of a woman.
But what I find difficult to explain, I'd love to see what you think of this, is the people who really confuse me are the people who stand by and just let it happen. I don't understand psychologically why there was such an agreement for the last 5 years amongst all my friends and even some family members that I had become evil.
Well, I think there'd be 2 reasons. Well, the first thing we need to understand is that the camouflage in which the narcissists and butchers that we're describing enmesh themselves is in the camouflage of empathy. And empathy is a cardinal moral virtue. Now, the problem starts when you believe that the fundamental essence of goodness is empathy, because that's wrong. Goodness is much more complex than a mere one-dimensional analysis would presume. But if I can accuse you of being non-empathetic, that's a pretty decent slur. Now, empathy also was a valid impetus or motivation for many things that were laudable. So the American Civil Rights Movement, for example, right? Now, the problem is that it can, and this is the problem, this has been demonstrated time and again by game theorists working in the biological realm. Imagine you have a community of cooperators, a game that's set up so that people only cooperate. If everyone cooperates, the game can sustain itself and improve as it's played. But if you throw one shark into the tank, then it takes everything. So empathy is a very useful foundation for social interactions. I trust you and I trust you. Great, now we can cooperate. The problem is that if you get a community of cooperators established, non-cooperators can move in and dominate. And so there's an ambivalence between trust and skepticism that's bound to emerge. Okay, so we produced a society that was very trust-based, in which empathy could function very effectively. And then it got weaponized. Now, it got weaponized by psychopaths and narcissists, fundamentally, and sadists. We know their type. They're Machiavellian, so they use language to get what they want. They're narcissistic, so they want undeserved attention. They're psychopathic, so they're predatory parasites, and they're sadistic. So they're fun people, and they weaponize empathy, and it's unbelievably effective. Now, part of the reason it's effective, and part of the reason I think that people didn't stand up, they didn't stand up for me in Canada, although some people did, and some journalists, none of my professional colleagues to speak of, almost no psychologists, virtually no physicians. agreeable, empathetic people don't believe that the parasitic, predatory, Machiavellian narcissists exist. They don't have that space in their imagination. And for them, so their default assumption is that anyone who's misbehaving is a victim.
Yes.
Now, you can even that's understandable, because you could say, look, 80% of the people in prison were victimized. Now, not everybody who's victimized turns into a criminal. In fact, quite the reverse. So that's, a rather weak demonstration. But that still also leaves the 20%, right? And they're the 20% that include the psychopathic rapists who, when the Scottish National Parliament decides that men and women are the same, decide that it's time for them to go into the women's prisons. All the agreeable people think, oh, those people don't exist. They're just misunderstood.
But then why don't they?
No, I think there's other factors in your case, though. No, because there are two other factors, I think, and one of which is that psychopaths are scary. And I think that to stand up for Graham in that situation would have made yourself a target. I think that can't be underestimated. I think that's very, very important.
Definitely.
But I think also, just hearing you discuss,
especially now that they've aggregated online, right?
Yeah,
they can
exactly.
Really attack
they've now got
with almost no. You can't even face your accuser.
No,
There's zero consequences of accusing someone, so that also enables everybody who delights in accusation. You think,
right? Well, they've got a digital militia. They've got that, but there's also when you're talking about some of the things you're describing about the body horror stuff, about the beliefs that we're expected to swallow. I think if you would have played this conversation to someone 15, 20 years ago, it would have been incomprehensible to them, what they're hearing. I think a lot of people just simply did not understand what was happening.
It's incomprehensible to most
people. Did not
people
comprehend
now.
Exactly. Yeah. So how can you stand up how can you expend that energy to understand the incomprehensible in order to defend you? I think a lot of it is simply that no smoke without fire. That so many people are saying Graham Linehan is a bigot. That's readily comprehensible in one sentence. I can understand that, but I cannot understand this whole other thing.
Well, it's also cost free.
Yes.
Like the cost to any given person for writing you off. Now you might argue about that with regards to your very close friends, but like I when we met at a restaurant the other night, and I mentioned to you that I'd been following you on X for a long time, and it was probably took me 6 months of following you before I trusted you.
Oh.
Well, because even though I know that this thing happens all the time.
Oh yeah,
and even though I knew that in all likelihood you were one of the people that it happened to, I still wondered, well, as everyone does, where there's smoke, there might be fire. And it's just, that's in addition to Andrew's point. It's like, you're asking a lot of people to defend you. They have to admit to the existence of an evil that, first of all, they can't comprehend, and second of all, they do not want to admit to. And no bloody wonder. Right. It's not surprising.
So, it happened recently where a well-known author, John Boyne, came out in defense, who was someone who had attacked, he wrote The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, very famous novel. He had attacked Graham back in the day. And I saw this, it was an incredible post. He wrote an apology online and said he now understands it. He's now looked into it. He says, I was wrong, you were right, I'm sorry. He said that to you.
Yeah.
It's quite a brave thing for him to do. By doing that, he's also put himself in the firing line to a degree. But of course, every time someone does that, and every time they are piled on and destroyed and demonized and monstered, it sends a message out to everyone else. You don't want to be that person. Yes. It takes a certain kind of strength.
Well, it's also the case, too, that a lot of this is now instantiated in law.
Yes.
So, for example, in Canada, if you're a physician or a psychologist, and you object to gender-affirming care, which is one of those phrases that's so pathological that it's truly a miracle of deception, then the probability that you'll be reported by an activist somewhere and that you'll face at minimum like years of legal entanglement at your expense with a high probability of losing your professional status and your license. Like the probability of that is virtually 100%.
Is it worth exploring? The weaponization of the law in the UK.
Yeah.
You've mentioned non-crime hate incidents.
Yeah.
Would it be worth me explaining what that is, and because that's the key weapon that activists have?
Well, we do want to delve into that, because one of the things we also want to explore is why you guys decided to move to the United States.
Yes.
And I'm spending a lot of my time in the United States for very similar reasons, and know of very many other people who are doing the same thing. Yes. It's no bloody wonder this country thrives, because whenever any other place becomes unstable, you can flee, so to speak, if you're the least bit creative and pursue whatever it is you want to pursue here and actually be, I would say, actually be appreciated for it. Okay, so talk about the situation in the UK and define this non-crime hate incident.
I think people here find it incredible because obviously you have the First Amendment in the US. We don't have a codified constitution.
It's not quite as central in the UK, freedom of speech. Yeah.
Yeah. Even though it's basically an English principle that the Americans adopted.
That's an understatement, but which is why a lot of us were so disturbed when in that vice presidential debate with Tim Walz and JD Vance, Tim Walz effectively said that hate speech wasn't covered by the First Amendment. A comment, by the way, which didn't make it to the official transcripts, I noticed. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
Did it not?
It didn't, no. I think it was because he was speaking at the same time as Vance. That might be the excuse. Right. Chilling thing to say, though.
Yeah.
Well, especially when the question, who the hell defines hate, immediately exists. And the answer is the person that you least want to.
Exactly.
Always, yeah. Well, that's leveraged immediately.
Absolutely.
And also Walz has a lot to cover up, you know, because it's going to come out what's been happening to these kids, and he kind of made that possible in his state.
Absolutely.
You know.